The time is here to start our session this morning. Good morning. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to everyone who might be watching the live stream online. We're here to talk this morning about entitlement reform, which in this particular year, at this particular time, might seem a little bit out of place, even more out of place than normal. Entitlement reform is never a topic that think tanks like to talk about it. Economists like to talk about it. People in the academic world like to talk about it. But our policy maker community doesn't like to talk about it very much, especially when it gets specific because of its difficulty. And in this particular election year, it seems like it's receding even farther from the priority list of our policymakers. So the question is, why bring it up at all? And I think the reason to bring it up is that despite what our best wishes might be, it's absolutely necessary in my judgment and in the judgment of the colleagues I worked with to produce the report that we're releasing today. It was available outside. It's called Increasing the Effectiveness and Sustainability of the Nation's Entitlement Programs. Our intention with producing this report was to highlight the importance of looking at this issue factually and in a non-biased way, and understand the importance for the nation's fiscal health of addressing it. We make a big point, however, in the report of noting that despite the overwhelming need to approach this from a fiscal perspective, the likelihood of success is inversely related to how much you emphasize the importance of its fiscal objectives. That politically and from the perspective of people who rely on these programs, what they want to know is how do we reform them to make them work better for the people who are dependent on them and might be dependent on them in the future. And so reforms really need to be proposed and put forward on their own terms from a programmatic perspective, not simply for how much money they might possibly save in terms of the federal treasury. So that's sort of the framework from which we began. I'm going to start from there. By the way, I should have introduced myself. That was a big omission from the beginning. My name is Jim Capretta. I'm a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a visiting fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. I will make some remarks. I will be then followed by, very pleased to have Doug Elmendorf, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and now the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. He will make some remarks following mine. And then we'll convene a very distinguished panel, which will be moderated by Joe Antos, and we'll introduce those participants at that time. So let me just talk for a few minutes about what we propose in our report, and then we'll turn it over to Doug for some comments. The beginning point for where our analysis and discussion is really from can be summarized on this chart that I'm presenting here right now. This chart shows in a stacked chart the historical and projected spending of the three biggest areas of entitlement spending in the federal budget. The bottom portion of the chart is Social Security, the middle is Medicare, and then the top in blue is the combined spending associated with Medicaid, and then in the projection window, also the Affordable Care Act subsidies for health insurance. So if you look back in time to 1972, we spent as a country at the federal level, this doesn't include state spending on Medicaid. If you look at the federal level, we spent about 4.4 percentage points of GDP on these large programs. And if you look at the top of the chart, across the top in the dotted line, that is the 50-year average of federal revenue, which is about 17.7% of GDP. Obviously, there's some ups and downs. It was higher for some periods. It's obviously lower during recessions, but that's a half-century average, 17.7% of GDP. So if you're spending about 4.4% of GDP on these big programs, and your revenue is close to about 18% of GDP, you've got a little bit of money left over to do all the other things the federal government is doing. Having a standing army and a navy, and building highways and running the FBI, investing in medical research and all the other things. Fast forward to where we are today, and you're at about 10% of GDP, a little bit more. So we've moved about 6 percentage points of GDP into these big spending programs over the last 50 years or so. And the question then is, well, where did it come from? How did we make room for that? Because actually the revenue line during that period hasn't gone up quite substantially. We'll talk a little bit more. I'll talk more in a second about where it's headed. But in that projection period, it didn't move that much. So where did the money come from? Well, frankly, it mainly came out of national security spending, that the United States used to spend a lot more as a percentage of GDP on defense, and today we spend a lot less. We're down, just compared to where we were in the early 1990s, a full, I think, 2.5 percentage points on average on the national security spending. That is a big shift in a relatively short period of time, and if that hadn't happened, we'd be in much worse shape than we are today. So we made room for essentially consumption spending through big entitlement programs, mainly through reductions in our national security spending. And by the way, we've also put the squeeze on non-defense discretionary spending too over a long period of time. So when people wonder what's the cause of our fiscal distress today, not even looking forward, if you just think about where we are today and the pressures we're under, a lot of it is associated with the fact that we're trying to make room for much more spending on the big entitlement programs. Looking forward, obviously this is from the Congressional Budget Office, looking forward, the projections are going to get much worse in the future because of all the two factors we know that are very prevalent, which are demographic shifts and the continuing rise of health spending on a per-person basis. If those trends continue, and there's certainly no reason to believe the demographics will shift anytime soon, and the healthcare spending, the most likely scenario is for continued growth above GDP growth. This is essentially where you are. And that's the reason why there's so much conversation around entitlement reform. How do we accommodate that? Obviously, there's a view, and it's already underway to some degree, that we need to put that dotted line on an upward trajectory. We need more revenue, okay? So during these past years, the Obama administration has successfully moved that line upward to some degree. We're at about 19% of GDP, headed toward about 20 on the federal revenue line. The last time we got above 20% of GDP in federal revenue, though, there was a big tax cut, okay? So it's not easy to sustain for a lot of reasons, but there's a view that we should push that line up. But even if we did, it wouldn't make enough room, very unlikely to make enough room to accommodate all the other commitments that the federal government's going to want to make and still retain all these commitments on these entitlement programs. All right, I won't belabor this. This is just the point of where this all leads. This is also from CBO. If you just stay on the current policy track, the lower line in the projection period is assuming current law out into the future, what happens to debt held by the public, the basic measure of federal debt. And it goes up above all historical precedent for peacetime. It already is above, and it continues on into the future. And then the line that really shoots up, that's the line from CBO where they make some adjustments on the policy side to accommodate for the fact that we may not be able to just continue squeezing defense spending forever, and we may not have some of the cuts and revenue associated with the changes in the Affordable Care Act and other provisions of law that look tenuous in a political sense. Okay, so what do we want to do about it? Well, our approach has been to work together. By the way, I should mention that the authors of the program authors of the study are myself, Andrew Biggs, Robert Doerr, Ron Haskins, and Yuval Levin. All of us will be represented here except for Yuval, who couldn't make it. We worked together over several months to come up with this, and it was very much a team effort. And what we decided to do was to start from some principles of how to move forward. I'll just go through these quickly. The cause is generally on entitlement programs in terms of our fiscal problems. We also want to make point that fiscal policy really be focused on fixing this long-term problem and not fixated so much on short-term deficit targets. Those are important, but not nearly as important as taking the steps now that relieve fiscal pressure 15, 20, and 25 years from now. We also make the point that this is not an exercise in trying to get rid of entitlement spending and the safety net. Far from it. It's intended to make these programs more effective and sustainable over the long run, and that the safety net should be a highly valued success story from the 20th century that we want to continue into the 21st. And the question is how to make it better and stronger. Entitlement reform should improve the fiscal outlook, but paradoxically, all of these provisions are going to have to be sold on their own merits, separate and apart from their budgetary results. And fifth, the effort should promote work, personal responsibility, market discipline in healthcare, and limited resources should be devoted mainly to households with limited means. Pretty much common sense, although the implications may not always be universally agreed to. Okay, now on Social Security, our expert in this is Andrew Biggs. He'll have more to say about this during our panel discussion, but just to summarize it very quickly, our proposal is very bold. This is not a proposal to tinker with Social Security. It's a proposal to really think about it in a new way, and it's a concept that I support, but I know it would take a lot of political discussion before it could be implemented. But this is a proposal to move toward a universal flat benefit for everybody in the United States. This would protect everybody at age 65 and older from living in poverty, which, believe it or not, the current Social Security program does not do. There are many elderly people who pay in partially into Social Security, earn a partial benefit, but still live below the poverty line because their benefit is low and their earnings record is not sufficient to push them above the poverty line. So we propose to make that the goal and main goal of the Social Security program, protect people in old age from living in poverty. The second main point of this is to obviously create a long transition to make this happen. Everybody who's been paying into the system to date has a different expectation and approach to their current contributions. We would protect that, and there would be a long transition toward this flat benefit structure. A flat benefit structure, of course, implies that people that have higher incomes during their working years to achieve that same level of income support when they're retired are going to have to save more on their own. In other words, their savings for retirement will not be run so much through Social Security. It'll have to be run more through their own private savings. We have a very robust and vigorous system of private savings in the United States, but it would need to be made more universally available to people. We would propose a number of steps to make that happen. There's some other changes that I won't go into right now for purposes of time, but that is the main proposal in Social Security. In healthcare, I would just note that this is a reiteration of a plan that was put together by a number of us and released through AEI last December. It's a comprehensive plan to look at healthcare across the board in a number of areas. One of my co-authors, Joe Antos, will be moderating the panel here in just a few minutes. There were 8 others besides us who put this report together on improving health and healthcare. It has 3 big features to it. It has, I should say 4 really. It has an approach to changing and moving away from the basic structure of the Affordable Care Act in a way that's more market-oriented, decentralized, and flexible. It has an approach to Medicaid reform that would fundamentally change one aspect of Medicaid that I think is the source of much of Medicaid's problems today, which is the matching system of financing. Today, the federal government pays a portion of the Medicaid funding in a way that incents more spending at the state level. The government will spend, on average, about 60% of every dollar spent by the states. And if you look at this from a political science lens, it basically creates a lot of incentive for state policymakers to move as much money as possible into the state Medicaid programs. That would need to change to bring some more discipline to the program, and we would do so by moving toward a per-person allotment to the states based on enrollment. There would be two parts to the program, one for able-bodied people and children, and another for the frail, elderly, and disabled. States would receive contributions from the federal government based on those enrolled populations. And then on Medicare, we propose to transition to a program of premium support. This has been debated endlessly over the last decade or so. It would be a pretty long transition. The idea here is to create discipline, and this is a point of view we have throughout our healthcare recommendations, that what needs to happen is there needs to be financial discipline at the point of making a decision about the use of an insurance plan, and then frankly down the road in the use of health services. That is, the federal government can and should support people's enrollment in health insurance, both through the public programs and the working age population, but that it should be done in a way where the participant in those programs has an incentive through themselves or perhaps through family members and caregivers to enroll in the most efficient way of getting their care. And that means something like a defined contribution approach toward supporting their health care needs. We would do that in Medicare. In the interim, before all that could be implemented, which would take about a decade, we would modernize the benefit structure, which is badly in need of some updating, and we'd update and rethink the current effort that is done on accountable care organizations in Medicare, where there would be a beneficiary option to enroll in something similar to it, but done in a way where the beneficiary gets to participate in the savings if that kind of integrated care would be better than fee-for-service. Finally, I don't have time to get into it all, but we'd also promote lifelong enrollment and use of health savings accounts across all of these insurance settings. And I'll go through this quickly so we can get to Doug. The last area of policy change would be in the area of our low-income support programs. We made a purposeful and conscious decision that this was not an area of the budget that we thought needed any large budgetary savings. Frankly, it's small in the budgetary scheme of things. But having said that, we also believe that there are areas that the public will want and see that the need for policy changes to make the programs work more effectively going forward. And so we included a number of recommendations across all of the major programs. I would just start with the one idea, and then many of the others can be discussed by Robert and Ron when we get to the panel discussion. But we wanted to test and think through, because they've been ideas that have been talked about for a long time, allowing states to receive funding for these major programs more in a consolidated block grant approach that would give maximum flexibility to the states to then design and implement programs to support these populations in ways that they wanted to test and see how they worked. In conjunction with that, we also want to test the concept of wage credits or wage subsidization, an idea that's been talked about a lot in the last 5 years or so, where a state government working with the federal government would test the idea of direct subsidization through payroll, not after the fact through EITC, but directly in a paycheck, subsidizing the wages of lower income households so that it incented work in a much more direct and visible way as part of an effort to promote employment and break some of the cycles of poverty. So those are two ideas that we would allow to be tested in a large way, evaluated, and then potentially, depending on how they turned out, expanded to more states across the country. We have a number of other targeted reforms and other programs, but they really fall under the theme that I outlined at the beginning of promoting work, ensuring program integrity, and ensuring that all of the programs are really emphasizing safety net, but at the same time, as much as possible, personal responsibility and work. Now for the, because I work at a think tank, I don't have to have a full CBO chart here, so Doug can see very obviously we're missing several years going out to 2040. You know, we just jumped right out to 2040 without telling you anything in between. But you know, what we did here was try to look at how these things would affect the fiscal policy, as I indicated at the beginning, really in the medium to long term, not so much in the next 5 to 10 years. Think about it this way: if we had taken steps in 1990 or 1985, we did take some, but if we had taken more steps in 1985 or 1990 or 1995 to change the trajectory or adjust some of these programs that would have taken 10 or 15 years to implement, wouldn't we be a lot better off today than we are? And so the very understandable inclination to say, why are we worried about 2030 and 2040? We have so many problems today. It's just a terrible way to make public policy on programs that, by definition, you're not going to be able to change by 2020 very much anyway. If you want to make a big change in Social Security, or you want to make any kind of even marginal change in Social Security or Medicare, you better do it now, or it's not going to have any effect in 2030. It's going to take that long to start to change how the programs work. And so our goal really was to look out to 2040. I won't belabor all these numbers, but the point is to look at CBO's projections of where we would be under current policy, and then have rough targets for where we need to go. And basically the story here is we're not going to cut defense as much as the current projections show. We're not going to bring defense down to some de minimis level, frankly, relative to any historical precedent. And so we're probably going to have to invest more in our national security than current policy out there would indicate, if we want to be in any kind of leadership position in the world. And that means we're going to have to do even more probably to try to keep our spending on our big entitlement programs roughly in line with where we are today and not allow it to continue to grow several more percentage points. And then on revenue, there's going to be a debate. My view is that it's going to be very difficult to sustain the position of moving revenue to 22 or 24% of GDP like so many people advocate. I think that'll be very difficult to do in our political culture. And so we advocate moving really towards something that's closer to the historical norm. I think I'll stop there because I don't want to eat up too much of our time that we want to devote to conversation later. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Doug Elmendorf. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and grateful to Jim for inviting me to participate. The report that Jim and his colleagues are releasing today is a very interesting take on entitlement reform, but I had to prepare these remarks before I saw the report. So I will offer my own perspective, and we will save the discussion of similarities and differences between my views and those of the authors for the panel discussion. To preview my conclusion, I think that entitlement reform should be pursued, but that lower and middle income people should be protected from substantial cuts in their benefits. Let me try to explain why I come to that conclusion. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, to forget one's purpose is the commonest form of stupidity. One of my colleagues at the Kennedy School uses that quote to remind people of the importance of setting goals before choosing tactics. So I want to begin by being clear about my goals for economic policy, including entitlement reform and other aspects of policy as well. I think the principal goal of U.S. economic policy should be to raise living standards for lower and middle income people. Between 1979 and 2011, real gross domestic product per person in this country increased about 70%. CBO has published estimates of income growth for different groups in the population over that time. CBO estimated that income before taxes and benefits, so-called market income, rose 16% in the bottom quintile, 9% in the middle quintile, and 77% in the top quintile. Now, you should not put much weight in those specific figures because measuring income growth is difficult, and those figures probably understate the improvement in living standards because the data do not fully capture the benefits of quality improvements and new goods. But the estimates do make clear that many people in our society have benefited relatively little from growth in overall output and income during the past several decades. That outcome is clearly unfortunate for the affected people. It is also unfortunate for our social cohesion and political process because many lower and middle income people feel a growing distance from higher income people and have a growing frustration with national economic policies. And this outcome is harmful to our country's international leadership because it casts doubt on the desirability of our system and because frustration with past policy choices hampers our ability to make policy choices today that would strengthen our leadership in the world. So therefore, as I said, I conclude that the primary goal of economic policy should be to raise living standards for lower and middle income people. I realize that my explicit focus on a distributional objective may be unsettling to some people. We tend to talk about overall economic growth and give less weight to distributional issues on the presumption, I think, that a rising tide will lift all boats. But the rising tide in this country in the past few decades has not lifted all boats. And I think we need to confront distributional issues head on. I do not view economic policy as a zero-sum activity. I do not like setting people against each other. But in making policy, we do face trade-offs between maximizing the size of the overall economic pie and generating slices of that pie of a minimum size for people in different circumstances. We should be explicit about that. If we are focused on raising living standards for people of modest means, then we should reject policies that would boost total income but reduce living standards for lower and middle income people. And we should support policies that would diminish total income to some extent if they would boost incomes for lower and middle income people. And that perspective matters critically for entitlement reform. So we need to recognize to start that reducing government benefits for lower and middle income people would generally make them worse off. Now, that statement may seem obvious to some listeners and wrong to others. So let me explain why I think it is both not obvious but also ultimately correct. In the simplest economic models, more consumption is better than less. And if people lose benefits, their consumption falls, so they are worse off. And we might stop the story there, but the world is more complicated than those simple models, and there are possible counterarguments, so I will offer four. But I will also say why I find those arguments unpersuasive and why I conclude that the simple, intuitive story is mostly right. So one possibility is that people who lose government benefits might work enough more to maintain the same total income and consumption. Indeed, I think people generally would work more if their benefits were reduced. When I was at CBO, for example, we estimated that the Affordable Care Act's subsidies for health insurance for lower income people would reduce those people's labor supply. And therefore, the elimination of those subsidies would boost their labor supply. And I view that effect on labor supply as an unfortunate consequence of those subsidies. However, cuts in benefits would not always increase labor supply, and even when they did, would not increase it by very much in general. As another example, CBO analyzed the effects of cuts in benefits in SNAP, or as it used to be known, food stamps. We found that work effort could increase or decrease depending on the specific nature of those cuts. Specifically, if policymakers focused benefits on people with especially low incomes by phasing out benefits more rapidly as incomes increased, then beneficiaries would face a higher implicit tax rate on additional work and might work less. We also concluded that the change in labor supply in either direction would not be very large because an extensive review my colleagues had conducted of the large literature on the responsiveness of labor supply to tax rates showed that the responsiveness is generally low. In addition, when the demand for labor falls short of the potential supply, as it has throughout the past 8 years, then even people who want to work may not be able to do so. Moreover, people with limited work skills tend to have significant trouble finding work, even when overall demand for labor is high. And even if people did work enough more to maintain their total income, they would lose time that they might otherwise spend on child care or elder care or other activities, and that loss of time for those activities would make them worse off. Well, that leads to a second way in which the simple logic that benefit cuts hurt recipients might be wrong. Suppose that work makes people better off in ways they do not fully recognize. Then reducing government benefits and making people work more might be in their interest. For example, people might work too little because they underestimate the long-term value of building skills and climbing a job ladder, or because they had difficulty following through on their plans to find work, or because they underestimate the importance of their working for the later work habits of their children. I think those kinds of stories apply to some people, but evidence that those stories are quantitatively important for significant numbers of people is lacking. Meanwhile, there is a growing body of evidence that children in lower income families that receive certain benefits do better in the labor market when they grow up than children in families that do not receive those benefits. Researchers have shown that children in lower income families that receive certain federally subsidized housing opportunities, health care, high quality preschool, and other benefits earn significantly more as adults. So if we want to help children in lower income families get a stronger start in their lives, the evidence suggests that reducing benefits received by those families would be exactly the wrong strategy to pursue. A third way in which the simple logic that benefit cuts hurt recipients might be wrong is that benefit cuts might increase overall output enough to raise recipients' pre-tax and benefit incomes by more than the loss of government benefits. So I agree that cutting benefits might increase overall output and income in the long term by reducing either budget deficits or taxes. For example, smaller deficits or lower tax rates might, over time, increase investment in business capital and thereby productivity and wages. Indeed, at the end of a paper I wrote last fall advocating the use of dynamic scoring for major legislation, I also advocated the use of dynamic distributional analysis, in which the macroeconomic effects of policy changes would be taken on board in distributional analyses. So I appreciate the logic of this argument. However, I see no reason to think that pre-tax and benefit incomes of lower income people would actually rise by enough to fully offset the loss in benefits. First, cutting benefits might actually decrease overall output and income by reducing investment in human capital, namely the health and education of lower income children, even if it raised investment in business capital. Second, even if overall income rose, lower income people might not receive a significant share of that gain. And third, even if overall output and income rose and lower income people received a corresponding share of that, their gains would be smaller than their loss of benefits. CBO estimated that non-elderly households in the bottom quintile of the income distribution in 2006 received on average about $13,000 in market income and about the same amount in benefits less taxes. Therefore, a 20% cut in benefits would mean a cut in their income after benefits and taxes of more than 10%. But CBO also estimated that reducing budget deficits by $2 trillion over the coming decade and larger amounts later, which is actually more than 20% of all means-tested benefits, would raise total income by only 3% 25 years from now. And the fourth line of counterargument to the simple logic that cutting benefits will hurt the recipients is that the supposed failure of the war on poverty shows that government benefits hurt lower income people, even if we are not sure of all of the precise mechanisms. I think that assessment of the war on poverty is not consistent with the evidence, though. The poverty rate, according to the official measure, has declined only slightly over time, but that measure excludes SNAP, Medicaid, housing vouchers, the EITC, and other programs that constitute most of the war on poverty. Measures that include those benefits show a marked decline in the poverty rate during the past several decades. Now, it is true and unfortunate that the war on poverty does not appear to have generated much increase in the market earnings of lower income people. the percentage of people whose pre-tax and benefit income is below the poverty threshold has not fallen notably over time. However, I do not think we could realistically expect much on that front in an economic environment in which technological change, globalization, and other factors are hitting lower income people so hard. Moreover, most entitlement spending goes, as Jim showed, to programs in which most beneficiaries are eligible through age, not financial need. So the spending dedicated to lower income working age people and their families has been less than some observers seem to think. The crucial good news is that our system of taxes and benefits has ensured that living standards have diverged less than market incomes over the past several decades. According to CBO's estimates, and I should say, CBO issued a new report yesterday updating its estimates by 2 years. I don't have the numbers in these remarks, but the gist is the same. According to CBO's estimates, over the last several decades, the bottom and middle quintiles of the distribution experienced growth in incomes, including taxes and benefits, that was faster than their growth in market incomes, and somewhat closer, although still short of, the growth in incomes, including taxes and benefits for people higher in the income distribution. In addition, the tax and benefit system provided a critical buffer during the recent economic downturn, when average market incomes in the bottom and middle quintiles fell markedly, but average incomes, including benefits and taxes, were more stable. In sum, I think the counter-arguments to the simple economic logic are not supported by the evidence. Reducing government benefits for lower and middle income people would indeed make them worse off. And that would work against what I believe should be the primary goal of economic policy. So where does that leave us for entitlement reform? It leaves me with 3 recommendations about entitlements and 1 about tax policy. First, entitlement reform that could truly enhance efficiency or equity and not just provide a cover for cuts in benefits should receive serious attention from policymakers. Numerous sorts of policy changes, including a number in this report, would meet this standard for serious attention. I have advocated myself the adoption of a premium support system in Medicare, in which all beneficiaries would choose between competing insurers and would bear the full difference in cost between their choice and a benchmark. That system could be viewed as an expansion of the current Medicare Advantage program that would strengthen competition between private insurers and strengthen competition between private insurers and fee-for-service Medicare. I favor premium support because I think it could enhance efficiency and be designed in a way to ensure that lower and middle income beneficiaries maintained access to reliable health care. However, some proposals for premium support have combined the efficiency-enhancing aspects of that approach with large cuts in benefits, including for lower and middle income beneficiaries. I would not personally favor proposals of that sort, and I think that calling them entitlement reform without being explicit about the benefit cuts actually hinders the discussion of entitlement reform that we're trying to have. My hope is that premium support and other possible changes in Medicare, Social Security, and other programs can be considered and evaluated without becoming just cover stories for benefit cuts or stalking horses in a debate about benefit cuts. Second, I think entitlement reform should avoid significant cuts in benefits targeted at lower and middle income people, as well as significant across-the-board cuts in benefits. Reducing benefits targeted at lower and middle income people would make them worse off, as I've just discussed at length. Making significant across-the-board cuts in benefits would also make lower and middle income people worse off. For example, nearly half of elderly Americans have incomes apart from Social Security benefits that would leave them below the official poverty line. Only about 1/10 remain below the poverty line after accounting for those benefits. So large across-the-board cuts in programs like Social Security and Medicare that provide benefits to a broad group of Americans would undermine the goal of raising living standards for people of modest means. Let me add that I think entitlement reform should also avoid across-the-board increases in benefits. There may be specific groups for whom benefit increases would make sense as part of broader entitlement reform. However, given the pressures on the federal budget arising from the aging of the population and rising costs for health care, as Jim showed, across-the-board benefit increases would not be the best way to raise living standards for lower and middle income people. Third, I think entitlement reform should include cuts in benefits for people with higher incomes. CBO projects that under current law, federal debt would rise indefinitely relative to GDP, and I agree with Jim's characterization that there are elements of current law that are neither desirable substantively nor sustainable politically. But the path of rising debt relative to GDP is not sustainable indefinitely either. So we will need to make changes in policy to at least stabilize debt relative to the size of the economy. And I think we should make changes that over time would reduce federal debt relative to the size of the economy. And I agree very much with Jim's point that it is much better to begin changes now than to wait, because significant changes of the sort that we are all discussing will require some period of time to be phased in. I think we should accomplish this goal of putting debt on a sustainable path in part by cutting benefits in entitlement programs for higher income people. And when I refer to higher income people, I do not mean just the top few percent of the income distribution, because changing just their benefits would not alter the federal budget in a notable way. Instead, I mean something like the top third or half of the income distribution. For example, we could change the Social Security benefit formula to reduce benefits for higher income retirees, but not others, and we could substantially expand the number of people who pay income-related premiums in Medicare. I recognize that this approach does not offer a free lunch. Making Social Security and Medicare more progressive would weaken the connection between an individual's taxes and benefits, and thereby undermine the earned benefit character of those programs if taken too far. In addition, lower benefits received by people with higher income will reduce their incentive to work and save. That has costs. But I think, nonetheless, this is the best way to reduce entitlement spending without unduly burdening those Americans who have benefited the least in economic terms in recent years. And lastly, my recommendation for tax policy, which is certainly different from that in this report, is to increase revenue above what would be collected under current law. 25 years ago, the number of people aged 65 or older in this country was about 20% of the number of people between ages 20 and 64. 25 years from now, that fraction will be 40%. This is essentially a doubling in the number of people for whom the government provides substantial benefits relative to the number of people of traditional working age who are paying most of the tax bill. It is not surprising in the face of that massive demographic shift that the federal budget is on an unsustainable path. I think the best response to this demographic shift and to other forces we are experiencing would be a significant increase in tax revenue relative to the size of the economy. Some of that increase is built into current law, as Jim mentioned. By CBO's projections, revenues will rise to about 19.5% of GDP 25 years from now, compared with 17.5% roughly 25 years ago. I think we should enact a further increase above that 19.5%. Given my goal of raising living standards for lower and middle income people, I would concentrate the tax increases on people with higher incomes, again, with a fairly broad definition of higher incomes, broader than you see in many political discussions. Increasing marginal tax rates would generally reduce work and saving, which would lower GDP compared with what it would be otherwise. However, the empirical evidence suggests that we can raise significant additional revenue without large reductions in the labor supply or capital stock, especially if we focused on limiting deductions, credits, and other special provisions in the individual and corporate income taxes. I would also tax carbon emissions because pricing emissions is the most efficient way to reduce them, and I would use some of the receipts to offset part of the burden on lower income people. So I will stop here. To summarize my views on entitlement reform with a sentence with which I started, I think that reform of entitlements should be pursued, but should protect lower and middle income Americans from substantial cuts in their benefits. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to add my own welcome to everyone for attending this important event. My name is Joe Antos. I'm with the American Enterprise Institute, and I'll be moderating this panel and attempting to keep them under some kind of time constraint. It's kind of like the attempt to keep the federal budget under control. But I'm counting on Doug and Alice, who who probably have more personal experience, well, not succeeding to do that. So there's something about that, yeah. So, Doug, among the many good points that he made the very important point that we are on an unsustainable fiscal path, and we should begin changes now, since waiting will only make the necessary changes more difficult. Well, we've been saying that for a few years now, but I have a feeling that, well, maybe not this year, but next year, I think next year is the time it's going to happen. And the sign of that is this week, the large number of reports that have come out addressing not necessarily the broad question of entitlement reform, but the equally important, or maybe for some people, more important issue about what can be done to reduce poverty. I'm sure the audience is aware that the House Republican Committee put out their report, which I think reflects many of the ideas or general principles that I think we see in the AEI report. The Center for American Progress put out their own version of reforms this week as well. And this isn't just a Washington only kind of a phenomenon here. Switzerland last weekend voted on something called the universal basic income. It was resoundingly defeated, but the idea was to give everybody $2,500 a month. That could be considered eliminating some element of poverty. Of course, Switzerland is not exactly a country that has much poverty, and $2,500 may or may not be, depends on what you consider poverty, I suppose. Well, our own Charles Murray, distinguished scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, is also about ready to release the second edition of a book that promotes a similar idea for the United States. But of course, he's a piker. He's only suggesting $13,000 a year, as opposed to what $2,500 a month would be something like $30,000 a year. And now Charles argues that technology will largely eliminate jobs for lower skilled workers. There won't be any substitutes, and so we've got to do something else. He also argues that in order to finance this, we'll eliminate 90% of the government. It's an interesting idea. I would say that the report we're talking about today doesn't embrace that idea. I think we're addressing the fundamental questions of poverty and entitlement reform in a way that reflects where we are and not where we are not, and not where we probably won't be going. But this does illustrate that AEI doesn't have a singular view on this topic or anything else. We welcome all kinds of ideas, no matter what we as individuals might think of them. You can't tell what I think of Charles' idea, but I've disguised it pretty well. Anyway, I wanted to introduce our distinguished panel, all of whom have had considerable experience, not just talking about these kinds of programs in a policy sense, but actually working with them over many, many years. And since I believe everyone has the bios, I'm just going to introduce them quickly, giving their current positions. But rest assured, everyone has a very lengthy experience with these programs. So this is the order in which the panel will speak. First, Andrew Biggs, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Let's see, we're doing Robert Dorr. Yeah, we're doing Robert Dorr, who is the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies at AEI. Then Ron Haskins, who is the Cabot Family Chair of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. And then finally, for the first part of the panel, Alice Rivlin, who is Senior Fellow in the Center for Health Policy at the Brookings Institution. So let's try to keep it to 8 minutes. Take it away.
8 minutes. Wow. Well, thank you very much. I'll have to read quickly. We're here this morning, all of us, to discuss a series of reforms to the federal government's entitlement and welfare programs. And I'm going to talk about the biggest program, which is Social Security. As all of you know, Social Security faces significant funding shortfalls down the road due to the aging of the population. But I'm actually not going to talk very much about the Social Security funding shortfall today. The reform ideas I'll talk about today are geared more towards how do you make Social Security work better as a social insurance program for Americans. The idea is that the funding shortfalls may be easier to address if we find ways to make Social Security work better for people. So the focus of Social Security reform, to me, should be on making Social Security work better as a Social Security program that first protects retirement security for people who need it the most, while not discouraging work and saving by the majority of Americans who are capable of saving adequately for retirement. The current program, unfortunately, often fails on both fronts. As a safety net against poverty in retirement, Social Security is not nearly as strong as it could be. Consider that about 10% of older Americans currently live in poverty, while we could provide a poverty-level Social Security benefit to every retiree for about half of what we currently spend on Social Security. Moreover, while many retirees live in poverty, Social Security continues to provide rising real benefits to middle and higher income households who, in the absence of such benefits, could and would save more for retirement on their own. So what I've tried to do is think of reforms to make Social Security more effective in protecting the retired Americans who need it the most without bankrupting the federal budget or the working Americans who support it. A principal shift that I've discussed in the report is moving from Social Security's traditional earned benefits approach to a true safety net program. Earned benefits mean while the benefit formula is progressive, they're still paid based on your earnings and contributions. Benefits rise with earnings, and despite the progressivity of the benefit formula, higher earning households still collect the majority of Social Security benefits. Now, the earned benefits approach, since the very beginning of Social Security, has had real political advantages. Social Security is not seen as a welfare program, so it's more politically sustainable than a more clearly redistributive system. But earned benefits have clear downsides as well. On the political front, the perception that benefits have been earned make participants reluctant to accept reforms, even if those reforms are necessary, and even if those participants haven't truly earned their benefits. Just because you've paid into the system all your life doesn't mean you've paid enough to finance all the benefits that you're expecting to collect. And on the policy end, earned benefits make the system more costly and less effective than it might be. Start with middle and high earners. A great deal of research, both in the U.S. and abroad, shows that middle and high earners treat government and pensions and personal saving as substitutes. The research finds that, roughly speaking, these households reduce their personal saving by about 2/3 of the amount they expect to get from Social Security. That means that personal saving, which helps the economy by providing investment capital, is displaced by taxes, which hurt the economy by reducing incentives to work. Less work and less saving isn't what we need when a smaller population of workers will have to support larger populations of retirees. As a result, Social Security benefits should be scaled back for middle and high earning households. Not overnight, but over time. People who can save more on their own should save more on their own. But second, a work and earnings-based pension system doesn't do much to help people without a lot of work and earnings. And these days, poverty in retirement is often a function not of a long career at low wages, but simply of sporadic attachment to the labor force. Those with short work histories will receive lower Social Security benefits and sometimes don't qualify for benefits at all. For instance, in the bottom fifth of the population, about 20% don't even qualify for Social Security benefits at retirement. And of Americans who do qualify, about 1/3 receive a benefit that's below the poverty line. The upshot is that we're paying a lot of benefits to a lot of people who could save for retirement on their own, but not paying a lot of benefits to people who almost certainly couldn't provide an adequate retirement income based on their own savings. What I've proposed is to gradually shift from our earnings-based Social Security program to something similar to the retirement programs in New Zealand and the new program in the United Kingdom, with some similarities to the programs in Canada and Australia as well. Over time, Social Security would transition to paying a universal flat dollar benefit to every long-term U.S. resident. The benefit would be set at the single over 65 poverty threshold. No one would get below this amount, and the over 65 poverty rate would almost immediately go from about 10% to something close to 0%. The flat benefit would increase benefits for about the bottom third of Social Security beneficiaries, and it would be indexed to wage growth to rise with the overall standard of living in the economy. However, while no one would receive a benefit below the poverty line, no one would get a benefit above the poverty threshold either. Once phased in, everyone would receive the same poverty level benefit. So while the bottom third would receive benefit increases, the top 2/3 would receive benefit cuts, at least relative to what Social Security has promised to pay. Cuts would be modest for people in the middle of the earnings distribution, but substantial for people with very high earnings. Those higher income people would need to save more on their own, and we would implement policies such as making automatic 401k enrollment universal and by expanding access to retirement savings plans to facilitate the extra saving that higher income people would need to make. As I said, these policy changes will be made gradually, and here I was guided by a simple and fair concept: to not reduce the Social Security benefits that Americans have already earned. Private pension law says that an employer can alter the rate at which employees earn future benefits, but the employer can't cut benefits that already have been earned. A similar principle should govern with Social Security. It's one thing to say that we must change the rate at which we earn future benefits. People understand the system isn't financially sustainable, and we either must increase taxes or change the rates at which we pay benefits in the future. But Americans resist the idea that a benefit that they've already earned will be taken away from them. So I calibrated the phase-in of the transition to the flat benefit in such a way that, at least with decent approximation, Americans will not have Social Security benefits they've already earned taken away from them. The flat benefit approach would effectively eliminate poverty in retirement, at least for long-term U.S. residents. Immigrants would receive a guaranteed benefit prorated to the time they've lived in the country, using the same scale that Canada employs for its own minimum retirement benefit. But higher earners would have to save more, and I'm confident they would save more. Overall, this approach would bring Social Security back to sustainable solvency while strengthening a safety net and leaving room in the budget for other priorities, many of which you'll hear about today. The flat benefit approach is also simpler, and that's important. In a mixed system where government provides a base of retirement income, but individuals save to provide the rest, the individual must have a clear idea of what he's going to get from Social Security if he's going to decide how much to save and when to retire. At present, most Americans don't have that. Almost no one understands how Social Security benefits are calculated, and the benefit formula is itself so complicated that many households with similar lifetime earnings end up with very different levels of benefits. Moreover, even people right on the verge of retirement have little idea what they'll get from the program. A few years ago, I used data from the Health and Retirement Study in which individuals right on the cusp of retirement were asked what they thought Social Security would pay them. Then after they retired, they were re-interviewed by the HRS and asked what their Social Security benefit actually was. When you compare the two, the results are shocking. To begin, about 1/3 of near retirees couldn't even hazard a guess as to what they would get from Social Security. And for many of the others, many radically overestimated or underestimated their benefits. The flat benefit system is much simpler, making it easier for younger Americans to understand how much they'll get from Social Security and how much they need to save on their own. How much time do I have?
You have, plenty of time, maybe a couple more minutes.
A couple more minutes. Okay. There are two other aspects of the proposal I'd like to talk about. First, the plan tries to encourage Americans to extend their work lives in a way that I think will generate some public support. We know that longer work lives can be helpful. Delaying retirement produces higher retirement savings, higher Social Security benefits, but a shorter number of years in which benefits need to cover. But Social Security penalizes people who currently work longer. The reason is that if you decide to stay in the workforce past age 62, you'll continue to pay Social Security taxes, but most people receive little or no additional benefits in exchange for those taxes. From a study I did when I was back at the Social Security Administration, we simulated people taking an additional year of work before retiring. And we found that for each additional dollar of Social Security taxes they paid, they received about 2.5 cents of additional benefits over their lifetime. So the point is you're getting almost nothing for working longer. In theory, you could adjust the Social Security benefit formula to account for this, but the problem is Social Security is already too complicated and nobody would understand or respond to the incentives. So the idea here is lower the Social Security payroll tax or eliminate the Social Security payroll tax beginning at age 62. This will provide a clear incentive for people to work longer. There's a great deal of research looking at the responsiveness of near retirees to after-tax wages. And while you'll lose some money from Social Security, you would gain more money back, or you gain much of the money back from income taxes, Medicare payroll taxes, and state income taxes. The second policy change that we would add to this is looking at cost of living adjustments. With this new minimum benefit that I would implement, beginning immediately, no new retiree would get a benefit below the poverty line. So new retirees would get an immediate bump up in benefits. Current retirees wouldn't get that because they've already had their benefits calculated. The idea is to change the cost of living adjustments so that lower income retirees, those with benefits below about $850 a month, would receive a higher COLA based on the CPIE, which is geared towards the elderly. Middle income beneficiaries would receive the same COLA as they receive today. Higher income beneficiaries would receive a COLA based on the changed CPI. The idea is to try to give some boost up for the lowest income Social Security retirees while scaling down benefits a little at the top end to pay for it. This has, I think, some policy rationale. There's also, which is to boost up benefits at the low end. There's also a political advantage to it, which I realized only afterwards, which is that the political dynamics of Social Security reform is that current and near retirees often feel very threatened by it. Even if you try to exempt them or say, we're not going to hurt you, they feel very threatened by it and they oppose it. This would, both the guaranteed minimum benefit for new retirees and the increase in COLAs for low-income current retirees would give older Americans some skin in the game, some incentive to support Social Security reform. And if we actually want reforms that will pass, I think that's an important thing to have. I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I don't know that you specifically mentioned it, but in the report you point out that one way to think about reform of any of these programs is if you were to start from scratch, how would you do it? That may be more challenging with the vast number of welfare programs that Robert's going to talk about.
So Ron and I had the responsibility of addressing the safety net programs that were not health or programs for senior citizens. And I want to reiterate one point that Jim made at the very beginning. We recognize that the bulk of whatever fiscal relief or savings we're going to get over the long term are really going to come from that other part of the report, not Ron and I's. That was not our intention. It's so much smaller than these other programs that was not our focus. That's not to say that reforms that we propose in our report might not result in savings, but they really are for the purposes of better serving low-income Americans in programs that are not doing as good a job at helping people get into work and up and out of poverty. So that's the first thing I want to recommend is make clear that where we stand with regard to that bigger fiscal challenge. The second point I want to make is we do recommend in the report that we experiment with a big idea involving providing greater flexibility to localities and states to see if they could coordinate these programs that we serve low-income Americans with in a much better way. That comes from what I saw when I worked for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City and what I see when I travel around the country and talk to people who serve low-income Americans and say they don't really understand how the federal government is serving poor Americans because it comes to them in so many different programs and different institutions. And it's discoordinated and not together and not clear. And they would like to have greater power to bring it together and serve the client or recipient in a holistic way. Now, that's a big change and not something we would want to do without testing it, doing it with states that are willing and able and want to do it, I work for a mayor like Mayor Bloomberg who would love that kind of authority. Others aren't ready or prepared for it, and it needs to be thoroughly evaluated. So the report calls for that as well. The next thing it does is it does something that may not be all that popular with some, is it makes targeted suggestions for improvements in the programs we have that Ron and I believe would actually make a difference in improving the way in which we serve low-income Americans, both to help them. And I want to just go through a few of those so that we highlight those. The first concerns the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is, I think, along with SNAP, our largest safety net program, and is an effective program. It reduces poverty and it encourages work. And we like the Earned Income Tax Credit. And we'd like to see it expanded to a population that is not well served by it, childless adults. But we can't do that unless we address the significant error rate that plagues the program. It has an error rate of about 20%. It's not all fraud. Some of it is hard to catch and hard to understand. But it's just a fact that we're not going to be able to enhance this program and make it work more for other Americans whom it doesn't benefit unless we fix it. Now, I also know that there's lots of people, including on this panel, who may have thought about this for a while and are going to say, Robert, we can't figure it out. But Ron and I can't really believe that. I think if the IRS had more time, if they were encouraged and allowed to do more matches against other data sources, and if they provided greater oversight for preparers, we could bring that error rate down so that we could save that money and make sure it's spent more properly and correctly. And I should also say, just as a political point, as I think politics does matter, conservatives and Republicans in Washington are not going to go along with an increase in a program for childless adults unless this problem is tackled. So that's recommendation number one. In the SNAP program, or what was formerly known as food stamps, we acknowledge also that it provides a great deal of assistance to low-income Americans, and it helps to lift some of them out of poverty, and it reduces very low food security and low food security, which are good things. And for many Americans, it's a great program. But it does not encourage work enough. I ran from 2002 up until 2013, either at the state level or in the city level, the SNAP program in New York or New York City. And I promoted it as a support for working people and an important assistance for low-income New Yorkers. And I think I may set the record for the greatest growth in SNAP of any local administrator. I don't like to say that here at AEI because it could get me fired, but it is a fact. But something happened while I was doing that, and that was a very large increase in the number of able-bodied, working-age adults who, when they applied for this work support, said they had no earnings. Well, if you have no earnings, SNAP is not a work support. And we need to do something about that. When I was co-chair of the Hunger Commission, we went around and asked people about the program, and many people told us, SNAP recipients, the SNAP program is very good at giving us an EBT card so we can afford groceries. It does nothing to help us get a job. So that, we think, needs to be changed. The number of non-disabled, non-elderly adults with no earnings grew between 2000 and 2013 from 4 million to 13 million on the SNAP program. That's a problem. We think it needs to be addressed. And one way to address it is to make a more clear work requirement or work expectation in the SNAP program. And one way to say that and express it very clearly is if you are offered a job and you do not take it, you will risk losing a portion of your SNAP benefit. I happen to think that works in helping people get into employment, and through employment and attachment to work supports, their earnings and total income goes up from what they were receiving on benefits alone. So it is, in effect, an approach that will increase income and reduce poverty. We also recommend in the report, and this is kind of a little bit not related to the fiscal challenges we face, but we have it in there, and that is the extent to which the food stamp program does not really do that great a job in promoting better nutritional choices for Americans. We recommend that, as the Hunger Commission recently did unanimously, that the food stamp program no longer permit the purchase of sugary sweetened beverages with food stamp benefits, a product that clearly is the leading cause of childhood obesity or the rise of childhood obesity in the United States. That is a proposal that's gotten some discussion about it. We recommend it as well. Now, I have one chart in a panel of distinguished at this. I was really reluctant to have a chart, but I'm going to do a chart. And this concerns the Child Support Enforcement Program. The chart here that I'm showing shows the number of custodial parents, single-parent households, and you'll see it remains quite high. and it hasn't gone down. The blue line shows the number of single-parent households who have an agreement or an order that allows them to know that they're going to receive some form of assistance from the absent parent. Note that it drops from about 60% to now 49%. Now, this is a little bit of an esoteric program. People don't know much about the Child Support Enforcement Program, but it is an important ingredient in helping people knit together the resources that allow them to have resources above the poverty line. Child support collections do reduce poverty, and to the extent that they are in single-parent households, where a large portion of our low-income families are, they are a significant contributor. But since about 2002, 2004, the extent to which the Child Support Enforcement Program is having an effect on bringing that additional income from the absent parent has diminished greatly. We think that's a problem. So we make a recommendation for that. And there are two reasons that we think this is important. The first is child support collections reduce poverty and they bring additional resources into households. There's no question about that. And the second is that having a child support program that is there to make sure that single-parent households are getting support from the absent parent enforces personal responsibility of the absent parent. We think that's important too. So the recommendation is that the one significant assistance program that benefits single-parent households take on a requirement that has long time existed in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which is a firm requirement that if you're seeking assistance from the government, you need to cooperate in helping us get a child support order for the absent parent. That has been true in the Aid to Families for Dependent Children program and now the Temporary Assistance Family program for a long time. And it's been a good way to get additional resources into households. It is not true in SNAP or Medicaid. There's an option, but very few states take it, and they're not encouraged to take it. The report that we announced today recommends that the cooperation requirement that exists in the cash welfare program, which has shrunk over the past years, be extended to the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program. And finally, we also recognize in the report that there is a portion of the low-income community or low-income population in the United States that is not well served by really any of our array of social services programs, and that is young, poor men who don't have children in the household. So much of what we've done over the years is to build up programs that support low-income families with children. Good, proper, appropriate approach. We want to help poor children. But young men are left out of that combination of assistance to get into employment and ways in which we provide aid to make work pay. For instance, the Earned Income Tax Credit doesn't benefit households without children in it very much. SNAP benefits really aren't very supportive of a single individual who is working. Other forms of assistance don't help that group. That group is very significantly struggling now. This involves people returning from prison, people who've had a very difficult and not satisfactory experience with our public education system in the inner city. And we make a recommendation that the Child Support Enforcement Program be extended to include work assistance programs, but also done in a way that is congressionally approved as opposed to by reg, which is something that was included in the President's recommendation. So those are our specific programs. I do want to put out a call for the nitty-gritty work of public policy involving small and important and incremental changes to programs that have been around for many years and, as I think Joe indicated, aren't going to go away tomorrow. That's part of what is in our part of our chapter, and I hope that we can continue to work on it. So I turn it over to Ron for the other parts of the report that we should talk about.
Great. I assume, Ron, that you will correct any errors.
No, I don't have time for that. So if there is some relationship between slides and a distinguished panel, I have 27 slides.
Yes, there you go.
So
You are far more
please
distinguished.
forgive me for implying that you're not distinguished. I want to make 2 points. What?
Sorry.
I want to make 2 points to begin with that I think are really interesting in the context of entitlements. First of all, TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is a program that replaced AFDC in 1996, and that's what I'm going to talk about here, is an entitlement in a very unusual sense. There is no individual entitlement. The statute states very clearly in plain English, there's no individual entitlement to a cash benefit conferred by this legislation. There was under AFDC. That was a huge change, provoked all kinds of yelling and screaming and all sorts of ugly statements, some of which were by Senator Moynihan, who is an implacable foe of welfare reform, and even caused him to say unkind things about his own president. So that was very controversial, but it is in the statute. So this is an entitlement to states. There's a fixed sum of money. It goes to the states. The states are entitled to that money, but no individual. The second thing is that it was a fixed sum of money, $16.5 billion in 1996, and it hasn't changed. So actually, we've already given that
That's right.
door. You know, the benefit is worth about a third less now than it was before, so TANF has already contributed, so you can't have any more, sorry. Now, the reforms were a huge experiment. I think it's one of the biggest social experiments in the history of the country, because it said you have to work, and if you don't work, the states have to cut your benefit, and they could completely eliminate your benefit. And secondly, there's a time limit anyway. There's a 5-year time limit, and if the states want to, they can reduce the time limit, which they did. So now all of a sudden in a program, and really no federal program has very strong work requirements, including the unemployment compensation program, where it's amazing that we don't have stronger work requirements, because those are all people with a work history. So now we have suddenly strong work requirements backed up by penalties. The states are going to use them. They have experience because they've been experimenting. 41 states experimented with these kind of forms leading up to the 96 reforms, and we have that the time limit and the work requirements. So now let's see, how did that work out? All right, so I might have to stand up because I can't see. This is Alice, right? Right. Oh, but I forgot. I was cleverly anticipated this problem, which has occurred before, and I brought my own slides. So, all right. So these are 16 to 54-year-old women and single, never married mothers. So look at this. Look at this. Look at the increase in the work. Oh, so much for that. The printer does not work on that thing. Okay, look at the bottom line, and you can see starting in roughly 1993, a little before welfare reform, when the states were doing their experiments, there's this huge increase in work by never married mothers. Those are the ones that actually had a job. It's a 40% increase over about a 4-year period. There's nothing like that in the history of Bureau of Labor Statistics records. A huge increase in a very disadvantaged, the most disadvantaged group of never married mothers, and their kids have very high poverty rates. Almost all of them wind up, at least then, they wound up on welfare. So a big increase in work, which was the main purpose of the legislation. And now what impacts did that have on poverty? And as you can see here, well, I can't point it out to you, but if you look in the middle of the slide, you'll see these big declines in poverty among kids in single-parent families and among black children who are disproportionately in single-parent families. So it makes a great deal of sense that these two things fit together. It's just exactly what Clinton said and what Republicans said. And by the way, the legislation ultimately passed by a bigger bipartisan vote than the bipartisan vote on Medicaid and Medicare in 1965. So it's a huge bipartisan vote, signed into law by a Democratic president, whose wife now, I think, is a little regretful, because it's kind of the opposite of what her main opponent is calling for. And they give everything to everybody, take it from Robert first and give it away to people who are poor, you know. All right, so the main goals of the legislation, I think we could argue, were achieved. But they weren't achieved without cost. There's no such thing as a policy with all benefits and no costs. And I think there are two costs that I am personally concerned about, and that I think we could do something about if we wanted to. Let me first, though, say the welfare reform was not just the work requirements. For a period of years leading up to welfare reform, the Congress had passed, I would say, 30, maybe 40 pieces of legislation that increased the work support system that Robert was talking about. Increases in the ITC, changes in Medicaid to take it away from welfare and give it to kids who are poor just by the virtue of the fact that they're poor. So we really changed the incentives. This is done by the Congressional Research Service, untouched by Republican hands, and it shows the effect of this system. The system now is, and this is the system we have in the U.S. now, is strong work requirements in the nation's the leading cash welfare program, and supplemented by EITC, food stamps, all kinds of benefits that people get. And as you can see here, at each step along the way, the poverty rate goes down. It cuts the poverty rate by half. And these are mostly people that work at low-wage jobs, 8, 9, sometimes $10 an hour. And what this is describing what actually happened based on Census Bureau data. So this is not some kind of model. This is what actually happens. It's going on now in the United States that people who take low-wage jobs can cut their poverty rate by 50% based on the benefits that they actually get from government. And we know those benefits are underreported. So it's probably, it is certainly more than 50%. So overall, the thing has worked well, but we do have the two problems, or actually a long list of problems. I have an article I recently wrote with a table with about 10 issues in it that we should address, but two of them are especially important. One of them is full of implications for the future. There's a lot of talk about block grants. First of all, you really can't use the term block grants on the Hill because Democrats hate block grants. They hated it before, and now they hate it even more because of the TANF block grant. And TANF has supplied some what I think we have to call reasonable arguments. Namely, the states have not been as committed to spending that money on the two major purposes of welfare reform as they should have been. Number one, help people get in work, subsidize their work, help them with child care, whatever it takes to emphasize work. And number two is to continue to have a cash benefit for people who are desperate, or as Moynihan used to say, paupers. We have a lot of people who are really poor. So let me just say a few words, especially about the issue of poor children, and there's a complexity here that Sanders totally missed, and so the whole country's been misled about this. The poverty rate went down. It came back up because we lost employment during the recessions of 2001 and 2007 and 2009, but it's coming back up again. But all during that whole period, it was still lower among kids in single-parent families than it was before welfare reform. So poverty is lower as a result of welfare reform. But there appears to be a serious problem at the bottom of the distribution, so that deep poverty, defined as poverty at 50% of the poverty level, which is really that, like $10,000 a year for a family of three. So that is serious poverty. And that appears to have increased. Now, there's some arguments that Republicans make about how accurate these data are and so forth, but I think they're sufficiently accurate. And in any case, part of the problem is the way the states have administered the program. Now, not only have they kind of backed off on being aggressive about helping people work, but they also don't pay a cash benefit to people who are paupers, to use Moynihan's term. And if you can see right here, this chart shows the number of people who get a cash benefit from the TANF program compared to the AFDC program for every 100 people in poverty. They're not necessarily the same people, but as you can see, people who are in poverty are much less likely to get a cash benefit out of the TANF program than were out of AFDC. I think you'd be reasonable to expect some decline, but that is a huge decline. And it means we have a lot of people, kids, living in families where the parent does not have earnings and now they don't have a cash benefit. That's a problem. We should do something about that. And I would strongly recommend that the Congress work with the states and get something done. I think they're probably going to have to change legislation in order to deal with it. So, in summary, welfare reform worked in the sense that it did increase work rates among people that a lot of people thought could not increase their work rates, and they did. And as you could see by the CRS chart, those people are a lot better off because of the work support system. And even during the recession, which was a big concern during welfare reform, the poverty rate was still lower than it had been before welfare reform, even though it went up during the recession. So in that sense, it worked. But we've got two major problems. One is the way the states are administering the program, and number two is this problem at the bottom of the income distribution that we should do something about. So I think that we should have strong work requirements in all of our federal programs, especially housing and SNAP, which we do not now have. Why would I say that in the face of this, my concern about kids at the bottom? And the answer is, first of all, Robert's already given away part of the answer. We should do this state by state on an experimental basis and demonstrate that it can be done. As it turns out, there's a 10-state demonstration going on right now, costs several $100 million, about exactly how we could have stronger work requirements in the SNAP program without these other effects that we would like to minimize if we possibly can. And we should do the same thing with housing. If we did that, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years from now, we could have strong work requirements in all of our major means-tested programs. That's what the American public wants. It'll be better for the people. Poverty rates will be lower, people in the programs, and poverty rates will be lower. So we need to go forth, despite the fact that we're having problems. I think we're having problems with the TANF. So we've set a good path. We can improve our policy. We're saving money, and we could also reduce poverty and improve well-being in the United States if we continue to make work a centerpiece of our means-tested programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. You can tell from this discussion that we're not just talking about fiscal policy. We're talking about policies that affect real people. Questions immediately arise about how successful we will be in devolving responsibility to the state and so on. I think we will get into that, but Alice, we'd like to hear your views.
Yes, Ron is a hard act to follow. I've known that for a long time. But this is a very important contribution, this paper, to the debate that this country urgently needs to have, and not just have, but resolve. One of the highest costs of the policy gridlock of recent years has been to postpone serious action on entitlement reform. I hope it will be possible to have this debate and to take bipartisan action once this election is behind us. Entitlement reform, as others have said, is crucial to dealing with two of the biggest challenges facing the United States. One is the fact that low and moderate income people mostly with limited education and other opportunities, have less and less hope for breaking into the middle class and are being left behind while the fortunate do better and better. Solutions here are not all to be found in reforming entitlement programs, but entitlement reform can contribute and, as Doug has pointed out, at least do no harm. Cutting benefits to lower income people is likely to make this situation worse. And the second challenge is the fact that over the long run, we need to live within our means. We can't afford debt that keeps rising faster than our income. We can't afford to spend so much on older people while we fail to give younger people the skills and tools to be increasingly productive. That said, I would amend the paper's claim that entitlement spending is the primary cause of projected increases in the debt-to-GDP ratio. A nation with a growing aged population has to decide how much it wants to support its older citizens and how to pay for it. It's the gap between the spending and the revenue that matters, and revenue can be part of the solution, especially if we reform our tax code. I'm going to focus my limited time on three parts of this very rich paper: the Affordable Care Act, Social Security, and Medicare, with a nod to Medicaid. But before I do that, let me make a couple of points about the nature of policy change that we can realistically aspire to in reforming entitlements. First, these programs, especially the big ones, are so important in so many people's lives, and changes seem so threatening to beneficiaries that change is going to have to be slow and incremental, no matter who wins the election. The paper recognizes that. And second, for the same reasons, serious reform must be bipartisan. Neither party can take the political risk of going it alone. And you may notice that Mr. Trump is not taking that risk. He's not talking about entitlements at all. Major entitlement reform requires searching for common ground, and I believe there actually is a lot of common ground between conservatives and liberals, and buy-in by the sensible moderates in both parties. We won't get there any other way. The Affordable Care Act is a great example of both points. It was a necessarily incremental reform, a niche reform. It was designed to expand affordable coverage, health insurance coverage, to a limited group of people who weren't covered by employer plans or Medicare or Medicaid. The authors didn't want to blow up the existing system and replace it with Medicare for all or a universal tax credit or anything that basically threatened the system. It had elements that appealed to liberals, such as comprehensive benefits and guaranteed issue, and elements that appealed to conservatives, such as consumer choice among insurance plans competing on an electronic exchange. It should have been the product of a constructive bipartisan dialogue. If this dialogue had taken place, and especially if the authors of this paper had been part of it, I believe the results would have been a stronger bill with broader support. But I do not think it would have been fundamentally different from what we actually passed. Since that didn't happen, all conservative proposals, including those emanating from the AEI, are required to start by trashing the ACA, calling it an extreme power, federal power grab or something like that, and then recreating it with different nomenclature, which is exactly what this paper does. Instead of income-related subsidies administered by the IRS, we have a refundable tax credit. Instead of guaranteed issue, we would have continuous coverage protection. Instead of risk corridors, we would have default insurance, sometimes known as high-risk pools. Instead of state flexibility through a complex waiver process, we would write specific flexibility into the law. I think that's a good idea, actually. It even says, and I think this is ironic, that the software of healthcare.gov should be made available to the states for free. I think that's already true. In other words, there's a lot of common ground here and some constructive suggestions of how to make the Affordable Care Act more effective are in this paper. Whether you call it amending the ACA or repealing it and replacing it with something remarkably similar. On Social Security, the paper goes a different way. I perceive that there is a lot of common ground on the objectives of Social Security reform, but the proposal is actually very radical. I think most of us would agree that Social Security needs to be put back on a firm fiscal foundation. It should do a better job of keeping older people out of poverty, and it should be less generous to middle and higher income earners. These are laudable objectives. I share them, but I think they can be accomplished in a much less drastic and therefore more politically feasible way than the authors propose. The authors would gradually phase out Social Security as we know it as a contributory social insurance program in which workers pay in during their working lives and get earnings-related benefits when they retire. They would eventually replace it entirely with a flat payment to all older people, regardless of prior earnings, at the poverty level. It would be a smaller program requiring less tax revenue, but it would keep older people out of poverty, at least if they'd lived here for 40 years or more. In keeping with the spirit of the time, I find this proposal strongly nativist. Somebody who emigrated legally to the United States and worked for 39 years wouldn't get the full benefit. I don't see a case for such a drastic change in such a popular, successful program that has weathered the test of time. The social insurance idea embodied in Social Security is one of the great ideas of public policy. People contribute during their working lives and benefit when they retire, and people with lower earnings get a proportionately better deal. Social Security gives people a lot of security, including middle and upper income people. It's important in an uncertain world where jobs disappear and financial markets crash. Social Security plays a large stabilizing role in the economy. Imagine the crash of 2008 if we had not had Social Security and older people had been much more heavily dependent on their 401ks. I'm not persuaded that low and even moderate income people will make voluntary contributions to their 401ks and not borrow against them that are as high as their previous payroll tax. I don't like losing the progressive benefit structure of the current Social Security formula at a time when we're all worried about the future of low earners. The authors are neutral about keeping the payroll tax funding for the new program, say it could be funded out of general revenues. But indeed, funding Social Security with a regressive tax was only justifiable because of the progressive benefit structure. A flat payment surely should be funded out of general revenue, meaning the income tax, but then you lose the sense of ownership and universal contribution. Instead, it seems much easier to me, economically and politically, to accomplish the goals of reform by improving the benefits at the bottom, reducing them at the top, that means adding another bend point, increasing the incentives to work, which is a strong part of this paper, and raising the tax cap. The paper's Medicare proposals are much more to my liking, although they're going to be a hard sell to real liberals. Liberals are victims of their own partisan inflammatory rhetoric about premium support in much the same way that conservatives are victims of their own inflammatory partisan rhetoric about the Affordable Care Act. Liberals will call it privatizing Medicare and ending Medicare as we know it. I would suggest dropping the term premium support. My friend Paul Ryan once said to me, "I killed it, didn't I?" And he did. Starting by making Medicare Advantage plans compete with each other on an exchange. Once that is working well and people are used to it, one can allow fee-for-service networks to compete as well. The challenge, and it is a challenge, is to develop sufficiently accurate risk adjustment techniques so that older people don't shift heavily to fee-for-service when they get sick. Briefly on Medicaid, dividing the Medicaid population into two groups seems like a step in the right direction. The younger acute care population can be integrated into the exchanges over time, and the disabled long-term care population needs to be handled separately, and there has been bipartisan support for incremental changes in the long-term care system, which I think is promising. In short, this paper is a major contribution to an important dialogue that can lead to bipartisan solutions. With this in mind, I would advise scrapping the misleading partisan rhetoric about the ACA and rethinking whether it's useful to be quite this drastic about Social Security reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Well, I'm sure that a certain nativist has a reaction, and everyone else has it. But let's go down the row here and make comments about what they've heard.
Well, the scalability of the guaranteed minimum benefit partly was there's a political concern that if you say we're going to give a guaranteed benefit to absolutely everyone, then you are going to get the nativist sentiment saying we can't give it to somebody who arrived here at age 64 and gets it at age 65. I thought a little bit of how to handle that, and the Canadians already have a way of handling it, which is if you were somebody who arrived here as an immigrant and worked 39 years, you wouldn't get nothing because of a 40-year requirement. You get 39 40ths, which I think is as reasonable a way of handling this as possible. I think there's a question of why do you work? Why is the change so radical? Why don't you just work within the current system, the current benefit formula? And the problem is that if you really want to have a strong safety net, you're getting a significant number of folks who are reaching retirement with low income, low resources, and it's not because they had 40 years of work at a low earnings level. It's because they had sporadic attachment to the labor force, and so a good chunk of people are either not qualifying for benefits or getting a very low benefit. A lot of those folks can turn to SSI, but SSI has strict income and asset limits, which basically means, if you go on SSI, you're going to be below the poverty line, and you're going to be below the poverty line essentially for the rest of your life because you have no way of getting yourself out of it. So the conclusion I came to is, if you want to really eliminate poverty in old age, you just have to eliminate it. And I know this diverges from the way the current benefit formula has worked, but if you look at the direction of pension reform in the United Kingdom, where they really spent a long time thinking about it, they're going to something very similar, something aiming towards a universal benefit. New Zealand has that, and they're actually at very similar benefit levels to what I've proposed. So one of the luxuries of being at a think tank is the willingness or ability to be radical about things. Certainly, if somebody sat down and said, "Well, let's negotiate out a deal," it's not I don't have some religious attachment to it. It has to be the way I say I do it. But I think certainly in conceptual terms, freeing yourself from the way we've always done it is a way of saying, where are we falling short? What can we do to move ahead on things?
I was really enjoyed Doug's comments about the role of benefits and work incentives, and I take the comments very, very seriously. But the only point I would make is that changes to the way in which we implement programs that lead to greater work and therefore, because of earnings, less eligibility, lead to less benefits being paid out and savings. And sometimes proposals that are projected to lead to that kind of behavior get characterized, kind of in the way Alice said, as benefit cuts. And they're not really benefit cuts. They are changes in program policy or rules that will lead to benefit savings, but actually will lead to greater income if implemented correctly. And I just want to be clear that sometimes happens in this dialogue. If you propose a work test in food stamps and then you project that fewer people will be eligible because more people will be working, Democrats will say, oh, look, you cut food stamps, you cut the benefits. And that's really not correct. And I know you weren't saying that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's very refreshing to be in a conversation again, first time in, it seems like forever, where everybody agrees that if you spend more than you take in, eventually you have a problem. And especially since nobody mentioned interest rates, I don't think. It makes a beautiful, I'd love to hear your theory of interest rates, yes. It makes a beautiful addition to Doug's chart if you put the interest rate on the top, because the interest rates are going to increase more than anything else, driven primarily by Medicare. These are CBO numbers, I believe.
Yeah.
So the deficit is a huge problem. It undermines everything else that we're talking about. Spending on children is already declining as a percentage of the gross domestic product for the first time in at least 2 decades. So I'm glad I'm here to hear everybody actually agree that mathematics still applies to the federal budget.
Right. Here's a statistic for you. So this year, this is according to Gene Sterling, the percentage of federal receipts left over after mandatory spending and interest this year is about 19.7%. And by 2026, if you don't change anything, it's 1.7.
Yeah. Doug's chart showed something very similar.
Yeah. Alice?
2 points that haven't come out explicitly. I share Ron's concern about the future growth of debt, and everybody's concerned about it. But remember, what we're concerned about is the ratio of the debt to the GDP, and one way to improve that is to grow the GDP faster. And one of the things that's being squeezed out is some pretty obvious investments in future productivity, in skills, in science, in infrastructure. You know the story, but we're not doing it. And we have bipartisan consensus that we ought to be doing it. We just can't figure out how to start the conversation. And the other is what Ron said about TANF. The states have cut the cash benefits drastically, and there is, I think, a limit beyond which you shouldn't do this. And there are a group of people who have serious drug addiction problems or criminal records or something that need some other kind of attention, but they and their kids have to survive on something until we invest in getting them out of the problem that they're in, which we're not doing very well, and cutting the cash benefits to the extent that the states has left some families quite destitute.
Yeah, we're kind of running out of time, but Doug and Jim, if you had some quick comments, that'd be great.
So I agree with many things that have been said, and I disagree with many, but let me just make 3 quick points. The first is that I am much more skeptical than Andrew that most Americans can fully substitute for the reduction in Social Security benefits that he's proposing through their own additional actions. I take the point that there is some substitutability, but substitutability is not perfect. It's very difficult to decide how much one should save, even if you know exactly what your Social Security benefit will be. It is very difficult to make oneself save, as we see in revealed behavior of many, many people across the income distribution. It is difficult to know how to invest your money. And if you've invested it, it's not easy to turn it into an annuity of the sort that Social Security provides. So I think the Social Security benefit is very valuable to many people at levels that are well above the poverty level. The second point is I agree with Robert's reminder that sometimes if one improves a program, then benefit payments fall in a good way, and I agree with that. But I think it's striking here that this proposal starts from the premise of trying to make the low-income programs work better. And Robert said it's not clear whether you might save some money, you might not save some money. But meanwhile, there's been a succession of budget resolutions passed by the House Republicans that have a very definitive objective of cutting spending on low-income programs by a third or something. So I think the fact that this proposal from AEI doesn't claim huge savings in those programs, that a report that Ron and others at AEI and Brookings did together concluded that I think the proposal would actually cost more federal budget money. This is exactly the concern I was starting with about one strand of serious thinking about how to make programs work better, and another strand, which is we're just going to cut benefits and save a lot of money. And those strands do not always fit together in a way that is asserted. And the third thing I would do is just echo Alice's comment about the limits of requiring more work. We have moved, as you know, and Ron played an important role in this, toward a system of work requirements mattering more for the receipt of benefits. It's in TANF, it's in the growth of the EITC relative to other programs. And maybe we should take that further. I'm not an expert on each of those programs, but I think there are limits to how far that can go. As Alice noted, there are people, a non-trivial number of people who have mental illness or drug addiction or other problems that really seriously prevent them from working. There are people who are taking care of their children or elderly parents in a way that we would probably endorse as a society. There are people who are looking for jobs who just cannot find jobs because jobs are not always available. So I think there is a real limit. We may not be at that limit yet, but I think, and Ron talked importantly about making sure we do protect people, and I think how far we can go further in the direction of requiring work is quite, while still protecting people who just can't work, is quite unclear.
I'll be very quick. I agree with Doug that I agree with Doug in the sense that I agree with a lot of things that were said and disagree with a lot of things. And they might actually be roughly inversely related to. I'm just kidding. But let me as is my want, I'll take Doug's bait from the very, very top. So the trap was set, so I'll fall right into it, right? Which was, you can't get where you want to go unless you pick the right goal. And I'm sitting there listening to Doug's goal, and I was thinking about it, and I just don't disagree. I just disagree with it. And the goal that Doug stated was the U.S. economic policy should be oriented toward raising the living standards of middle and low-income people. And I think fundamentally, if U.S. economic policy isn't focused on promoting growth and opportunity across the board, we're sunk, basically. That if we have a 2% growth economy with great redistribution, it's a society that is likely to be at war with each other. If we have a 4% growth society with good redistribution, we'll be okay. And I think fundamentally the idea of putting that goal at the top is basically our problem. And so I do think it's an important but subtle point, but I just sort of come at it totally differently. Secondly, with regard to Social Security's popularity, I hear this all the time. And look, President Roosevelt was brilliant. All right, he basically said, everybody pay into this system, every paycheck for your entire working life, and then we'll give you a check at the end in your retirement. And the check turns out to be pretty good for a lot of people, and they think, hey, this is pretty good. But is it really that surprising that people like getting a check in the mail every month in retirement? I'm not shocked by this, okay? That does not mean that it's operating the right way. If you just dig underneath the hood a little bit, you realize there's massive inequity, there's lots of opaqueness, people are getting a raw deal lots of times and are perfectly happy with it because they don't know the difference. And so I'm not sure we should just sort of say, yeah, but it's keeping social cohesion, they're getting a good benefit, I think we can do better. Now, do I understand Alice's point that the proposal we've made is a step way too far for most Americans? I do understand that. But I think it's important to understand that we're piecing through what should be the goal, how should it actually orient, what's the division of responsibilities between the government and the citizen, and the proposal we make is much more clear in that regard, frankly, than Social Security is today. And then the last point on Alice's ACA point, which was very clever in how she did it and subtle, and I appreciated it. I disagree with it. I think if you presented our plan on how we would approach reforming health care for the under age 65 population, the proponents of the Affordable Care Act, who passed it and enacted it, would hate it. So there's obviously a reason why they would hate it. They wouldn't hate it because, there's no real difference and it's all word changes. They'd hate it because fundamentally in health care, you have to understand it's placed in the context of a political economy. That is, you've enacted something that will not be static. It will change over time and be dynamic. They've set in motion many provisions that now are under the control of the federal government, and you can already see it happening, that the federal government is exerting control over benefit design, insurance premiums, and frankly, through the Medicare program, how the entire system of physicians and hospitals interact with each other. That's what we object to. And I don't think it's just a semantic thing. And so the provisions that we would enact, yes, they start with the basic architecture of an employer-based system and tax credits for people that are outside of it. There's no getting around that. That's the reality of it. But that doesn't mean it's all the same. And so, anyway, those are just a couple of reactions. Thank you.
Thanks. I know everybody would really like to respond to everybody else, but let's give the audience a chance. And it has to be a question. It has to be brief. No speeches. I will cut you off. Okay, so let's start over here. Quickly, run. We're trying to get the audience outside to hear you too. Thank you. Please identify yourself and a quick question.
Yeah, John Cummings. Regarding the Medicare proposal, my understanding is that the government-run Medicare program is much more efficient than private insurers, running about 3 cents on the dollar versus 14 cents on the dollar or 20 cents on the dollar for private insurance companies, because much of that goes to profit. One talks about...
Question?
Yeah. Why not grab that difference? Why?
It doesn't exist. I'll answer it for you. It doesn't exist. The administrative cost that you're talking about is only the administrative cost at CMS. It doesn't count the cost at Social Security, which actually does a lot of the processing, and IRS. So in fact, I'll talk to you later, but there are studies that point out that basically the administrative costs on a per person basis are about the same or maybe even a little bit higher. It also has something to do with the way you do the calculation. Medicare beneficiaries spend a lot more money because they're older, and so the calculation is always as a percentage of spending per person. But if you did it on some other basis, you'd get a different result. Okay, up here. Quickly, please. Yeah, quickly.
What do you
And then
think
we'll get to
about
this later.
moving SSDI to a formula block grant program, taking the basic allocation that comes out of the tax, and then formula block grant that to the states? Because disability income is a function of where you live and your disability, and with the states having the ability to better police and control the amount of outlay.
You already have disability is a funny system in the sense that it's run by Social Security, but administered to a great degree by the states. And you already have a lot of disparity in states between acceptance rates for SSDI from one state to the next. I didn't talk very much about DI up here, but that is a program that really needs some help. I'll just give you my basic thing is that there's a lot of emphasis, I think, among congressional Republicans of saying, how do we, for people who are on DI, how do we improve incentives to get them working, get them off disability by changing the earnings caps and all that. I'm not against it. I'm not hugely optimistic that's going to do it. I think you need to look at the countries that have really successfully addressed their disability systems. Netherlands, Sweden's done a lot, and that is, how do you take people who have disabilities and keep them working? Self-reported disabilities, say, are almost exactly the same as they were 30 years ago. The problem is the percentage of people who say they have a disability who are working is in the basement right now. So it's, how do you keep people working and keep them from going on the benefits in the first place? I haven't thought very much about block granting to states, though.
Okay. You get about 15 seconds to ask a question. 15 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. But I think we are talking about reform. And by reform, we have really tackled the issues, the problem. But so far as I know, the only one I think is pretty good is a flat tax. That will simplify the tax code so everybody understanding the problem. For the rest of the problem, employment...
Okay. So basically your point is that a flat tax would make more sense?
No, my point is...
We've run out of... I'm sorry, we've run out of time.
My point is, how do you address the problem? The employment or economic discovery is not really related to how much you pay out for the social program, but how much it benefits the people who really contribute to the production and economy.
Jim.
Yeah. I think, there's a lot of agreement on the panel here that there needs to be redistribution in our tax and transfer systems. The question is amount of degree and what's the best way to have a division between responsibility of a citizen and responsibility for general taxpayers. And I'm of the view that we basically have gotten it right over the course of the 20th century, but that's not going to work in the 21st century, that we're now, because we postponed changes for basically the last 25 years now, haven't really made much change in it, that we've piled up a whole bunch of things that need to be adjusted at this point, and we're going to have to do it in the next decade. Otherwise, we're going to be lost. I don't think that means, however, moving to a totally fundamentally different tax system. I think our tax system needs to be reformed to be flatter, fairer, and broader, but I think more important are the kinds of changes we talked about today.
Right. And AEI held a tax reform event just a couple of days ago, so people should look online and see
that one.
And see how that went. Anyway, please join me in thanking a panel for a really great discussion.
This was fun.
Yeah, thank you. By the way,